Sam was, as many in the industry would later say, a prince among men. He seemed to have every possible advantage stacked in his favor: the looks, the voice, the polished manners, the easy charm, the unshakable composure. Then there was the teenage gospel singer who would one day be crowned the Queen of Soul, standing in his shadow and watching closely. Aretha Franklin was 11 years younger than Sam, still forming her own sound, while he was already bending entire audiences to his will. Interviewers often asked her the same question: "Did Sam ever give you tips on how to sing?" She would smile slightly and answer, "No, he didn't. Not like that," because, as she quietly admitted later, she didn't really see Sam as a vocal coach. She saw him as something else entirely. In the final months of her life, while the public believed Aretha was fading quietly away in Detroit, something very different was unfolding behind the shut doors of her home. Lying in her private room, family gathered close. She began repeating a name she had refused to speak in public for more than 50 years. According to relatives who were present, her voice was fragile, fading at the edges, but the fear wrapped around that name was unmistakable. She said the name belonged to the person who had guided Sam Cooke toward his final night, the person who, in her mind, set off the chain of events that ended with his body bleeding on the floor of a cheap Los Angeles motel in 1964. And what she shared, they later recalled, wasn't a rumor she'd heard secondhand or a half-remembered story. It was a belief she had protected in silence because she considered it too dangerous to say out loud while she was still alive. In her view, if her suspicions were correct, Sam Cooke hadn't simply walked into danger. He had been walked there, not just pushed toward a trap, but quietly guided into it step by cautious step. "Are you ready to hear the name?" she whispered. The trail begins on a cold November night in Detroit, 1959. Backstage at the Fox Theater, the show had just ended. The spotlights overhead were cooling, ticking softly as they dimmed, and the faint steam of performers' breath hung in the narrow hallway like ghostly smoke. Stagehands squeezed past with coils of cable over their shoulders. Singers laughed and shouted somewhere down the corridor, the noise bouncing off cinder-block walls. Under a flickering bare bulb, 17-year-old Aretha Franklin looked up and saw Sam Cooke walking toward her. He was still carrying the glow of the performance with him, coat tossed neatly over one shoulder, hair slicked back, his voice still warm with confidence as he greeted people along the way. Aretha would later say that in that hallway, time seemed to stretch, as if the world understood something important had just been set in motion. Sam reached for her hand, taking it in both of his, gentle but deliberate. He told her he had been listening to her early gospel work, tracking her progress long before she ever knew it. For a few seconds, neither of them said anything else. The silence between them was charged, like the moment before a curtain rises. It was the first thread of a connection she would not fully understand until decades later. By February 1960, Sam was back in Detroit. Snow was banked high along Woodward Avenue, and the marquee of the Fox Theater hummed and buzzed in the cold air. After the show, Sam specifically asked that the Franklin family come backstage. Aretha followed her father down a tight stairway, the sound of Sam's voice echoing faintly off the concrete as they approached. Inside the dressing room, Sam waved everyone in, then closed the door himself. At first, the conversation was light jokes, compliments, music talk. But slowly the tone shifted. Sam leaned toward Aretha and, in a quieter voice, admitted he was trying to get away from the people who were controlling him. The smile slipped from his face. His fingers began tapping a restless rhythm on the arm of his chair. He told her he felt watched. That was the first detail that struck her as strange. As he spoke, he kept glancing toward the closed door, as if expecting it to swing open at any moment. Over the next several years, their paths crossed again and again. Chicago, April 1961. Aretha found him pacing a backstage corridor before a show, his footsteps repetitive on the worn floor. The room was chilly, yet sweat gathered on his forehead. He told her he was building his own label, SAR Records, and that powerful people were warning him against it. He didn't list any names. He just said, "They don't want me free." His voice broke slightly on that last word. Then there was New York, in the summer of 1962 at the Apollo Theater. Moments before stepping onto the stage, Sam pulled Aretha to the side. The horns were warming up, blaring short bursts from the bandstand. A microphone squealed somewhere in the background. When Sam reached for his drink, she noticed the shake in his hand. He said he had a meeting scheduled with someone who, in his words, won't take no for an answer. Aretha remembered the way he said it for the rest of her life, flat, resigned, like a man preparing to walk toward something he already feared but could not avoid. And then came the moment that would haunt her most. On the 14th of October, 1963, after a concert in Chicago, Sam joined Aretha's family for a late dinner. He arrived an hour late. His tie was crooked, his shirt wrinkled as if he had been gripping it in his fists. When he finally sat down, he didn't speak right away. He scanned the restaurant, eyes moving from table to table as if he were checking for someone listening in. Leaning across the table, he lowered his voice and said he felt cornered. He told them he didn't know who he could trust anymore. Then he mentioned a name, someone connected to his business affairs who had started appearing at every turn, at shows, at meetings, at dinners. Someone who seemed to materialize wherever he went. Aretha never repeated that name publicly, but she never forgot it. In the weeks that followed, multiple people claimed Sam's behavior became increasingly erratic. He seemed to be meeting with the wrong people, stepping into circles that deepened his tension rather than easing it. When Aretha saw him in Los Angeles in July 1964 at a recording studio just off Sunset Boulevard, he looked exhausted. He rubbed his temples, wiped sweat from his jawline, and checked the hallway twice before finally closing the studio door behind them. He told her he had been getting phone calls at strange hours, not friendly calls, calls with instructions he didn't fully understand, calls with warnings that kept him awake at night. He didn't say outright who was behind them, but the implication hung in the room. Someone had forced their way into his life with serious intention. After that, everything accelerated. On the afternoon of the 11th of December 1964, Sam Cooke left his home wearing a dark jacket, a crisp white shirt, and a gold watch at his wrist. He climbed into his Ferrari and pulled away alone. A neighbor later said he seemed unusually tense, his jaw clenched, both hands locked tight on the steering wheel. A friend would later claim Sam mentioned having business to handle that night, business he didn't want, but business he believed he couldn't refuse. For Aretha's circle, that was the last confirmed glimpse of him before everything came apart. Years later, when Aretha replayed the timeline over and over in her mind, she said she noticed something chilling. Every odd phone call, every rushed backstage conversation, every fearful glance she had seen in Sam's eyes, all of it pointed toward that night. The pattern wasn't random. It felt coordinated, a buildup. And buried inside that buildup was a single person Sam had reluctantly allowed into his orbit. Someone he'd told Aretha he did not trust. Someone he met with shortly before his death. Someone who was missing from most official records. Someone whose name she carried like a stone pressing on her chest for half a century. When reporters asked Aretha about Sam in the years after, she kept her answers cautious, polished, distant from the details. But during an off-camera conversation in 1972, technicians later claimed she said one sentence that froze the room. He didn't walk into that motel alone. Someone walked him there. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to, because, in her mind, the outline of the truth was already painfully clear. Aretha believed she knew exactly who had set the chain reaction in motion that pushed Sam Cooke toward his final night. The chain reaction, as Aretha would later describe it, truly began at 5:06 p.m. on the 11th of December, 1964. Sam Cooke stepped out of his Los Angeles home into the cool evening air. The sky was turning a deep orange, the city sliding toward that restless winter darkness when everything feels slightly on edge. Neighbors saw him walking briskly toward his Ferrari, shoulders stiff, his steps clipped and sharp, like a man running late for something he did not actually want to face. He drove off with no music playing, eyes fixed straight ahead, jaw locked. Even at that early hour, it was as if the tone of the night had already been decided. By 7:30 p.m., Sam arrived at Martoni's, an upscale Italian spot on Sunset Boulevard where artists and executives often met for business dressed as dinner. Staff noticed his uneasiness right away. He kept his jacket on, unusual for a man who normally seemed so at ease in public spaces. He didn't order food. He sat at the bar instead, tapping his foot against the leg of the stool, glancing toward the entrance every few minutes, as if he was waiting for someone he wasn't sure he wanted to see. People close to him would later say he looked like a man trying to steady himself before something inevitable. He stayed less than an hour. When he finally stepped back outside, the restaurant's valet allegedly watched him grip the keys too tightly, staring at nothing for a long moment before sliding back into the driver's seat. Instead of heading toward the usual nightlife spots or back to familiar neighborhoods, Sam turned south, away from friends, away from the routes he typically chose. For those who studied his final movements later, this was the first sign that he might have been following a path set for him, not by him. From around 9 p.m. until nearly 10 p.m., Sam moved through a series of bars in south-central Los Angeles. Witnesses at each place later remembered the same unsettling pattern. He wasn't drinking heavily. He wasn't settled into conversations. He didn't seem relaxed, even when people approached him. What he kept doing, again and again, was looking around toward doors, toward windows, out into parking lots, as if checking whether a promise or a threat was about to walk in. Some people said he looked like he was waiting for someone. Others insisted he looked like he was trying not to cross paths with someone. Either way, the implications were disturbing. Sometime around 10 p.m., Sam encountered a woman named in reports as Alyssa Boyer. What exactly passed between them in those first moments remains murky to this day. Witnesses described Sam approaching her calmly, but with a quiet urgency beneath the surface. They eventually left together around 1:30 a.m. His Ferrari cutting through the fog as he drove south again, weaving through a series of turns that didn't match any simple date-night route. These weren't casual detours. They were sharp departures from the paths he usually took. Then came the detail that never quite aligned with the official story. Sam steered into a neighborhood where he had no close ties. He avoided the major roads. He slowed at odd intersections. His headlights swept across side streets as though he was searching for something specific or following instructions that weighed heavily on him. Looking back, Aretha came to believe that by this point, Sam was no longer acting purely on impulse. In her eyes, he was moving under pressure. At approximately 2:15 a.m., the Ferrari pulled into the gravel lot of the Hacienda Motel, a low, worn building that could look abandoned even when it was full. The neon vacancy sign buzzed faintly in the cold air. Paint flaked off the exterior walls. The light in the office flickered overhead, casting weak shadows. This was not the kind of place Sam Cooke, a star of his stature, would normally have chosen. Yet he parked. He stepped out. He walked toward room 3, a room registered under Boyer's name. What happened next has remained one of the most disputed and unsettling sequences in music history. Within minutes of entering the room, something went wrong. Boyer later claimed she felt unsafe and rushed out, carrying her clothes. Sam followed shortly after, half-dressed, panicked, disoriented, searching. Witnesses heard heavy footsteps pounding along the concrete walkway, the frantic thud of someone running in fear or in rage. Sam's voice echoed through the corridor, sharp and urgent, demanding answers. His shirt hung off one shoulder. His feet were bare. Something, or perhaps several things, had been stripped from him: his wallet, his money, his sense of control. Around 2:30 a.m., with tension thickening in the motel's night air, Sam began hammering on the manager's office door, shaking it so violently that the metal frame rattled. The noise sliced through the stillness. To some, it sounded like pure desperation. To others, it carried the edge of terror. Moments later, a single gunshot cracked through the courtyard. The echo bounced off the walls. Sam collapsed onto the worn, stained carpet inside the office, blood seeping from his chest, his breathing slowing. Then the motel slipped back into an eerie silence. A legend died on the floor of a place he had never visited before, under circumstances that never fully aligned with the story that would later be officially stamped on record. Police arrived quickly, but the confusion arrived quicker. Timelines shifted. Statements contradicted each other. Some physical evidence seemed incomplete or out of place. His wallet was missing. His watch was missing. The motive was blurry at best, and hovering behind every inconsistency, at least in Aretha's mind, was the same invisible pressure she believed had been building for months. The unseen presence of the person Sam had feared. The one he had told her kept appearing uninvited. The one he had been trying to avoid long before that motel room. As the news broke the next morning, the world staggered. Newspapers rushed out sensational headlines. Radio hosts speculated on air. Fans cried in their kitchens, in their cars, in small apartments that suddenly felt too quiet. Aretha Franklin, sitting alone in a still Detroit house, did not cry right away. Instead, she played back every conversation Sam had shared with her in the months before his death. Every uneasy meeting, every warning, every shadow that lingered behind his words. And something inside her hardened. She came to believe something most people never even considered, that the motel wasn't the beginning of the story, it was the conclusion. The last act of a long buildup of pressure allegedly applied by someone Sam didn't trust, someone he feared enough to name to her in private, someone who, as far as she could see, vanished cleanly from the official record. That realization followed her for the next 50 years, through award ceremonies, through long drives between cities, through backstage corridors, through lonely hotel rooms at midnight. It stayed with her as her own fame rose higher, as the industry changed around her, and finally, as she lay in the dimly lit bedroom where the story would eventually break free. Because to Aretha Franklin, Sam Cooke did not walk blindly into tragedy. In her eyes, he was steered, he was guided, he was led. And as she reached the end of her own life, she finally let the name behind that belief slip into the room. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. It did not come to her as a single blinding revelation. It crept in slowly, uneasily, like a fog that refused to lift no matter how many times Aretha tried to explain it away. In the months after Sam Cooke's death, she tried to mourn him the way everyone around her did, quietly, with whispered prayers and the reluctant acceptance that sometimes tragedy arrives without a clear reason. But the longer she sat alone with her memories, the more the official story felt thin, too clean, too convenient. And while the world learned to live with the version printed in newspapers, Aretha began noticing fractures in that story, cracks that widened year after year. It started in 1965. Only months after Sam's funeral. Aretha was backstage at a show in Philadelphia when she crossed paths with a session guitarist who had toured briefly with Sam. The moment his name came up, the man's demeanor shifted. His shoulders tightened, his eyes dropped. He said Sam had been anxious and distracted in the week leading up to his death, darting from meeting to meeting like someone being pushed by a force he couldn't refuse. The guitarist also mentioned, almost under his breath, that Sam was supposed to attend a final appointment on the night he died, a meeting that, according to him, never made it into any police file. That single comment lodged itself deep inside Aretha's memory. She didn't argue, she didn't press, but something in her locked into place. The pattern thickened in 1966. She ran into a pianist who had played on Sam's early gospel records. He looked older, worn down, like a man who had been holding on to more than his share of secrets. He said he'd heard from someone close to Sam that a private meeting had been scheduled for the evening of December 11. It wasn't a typical business sit-down, he insisted. It wasn't a friendly get-together either. It was something Sam had felt cornered into attending. Nobody seemed to know who had arranged it. Nobody could say exactly what it was about. But everyone who whispered about it supposedly agreed on one thing. Whoever Sam was meant to meet that night never appeared in any official statement. In that moment, Aretha began to suspect that the silence around that meeting was not an oversight. It felt intentional. As the late 60 seconds unfolded, Aretha's fame soared. With it came a harsher view of the music world's inner workings, the quiet power struggles, the unwritten rules, the invisible hands that could build or erase someone's future without leaving fingerprints. When she turned her mind back to Sam's final year, the timeline began to trouble her. Around 1963 and 1964, Sam had been deeply involved in a fight over ownership of his masters. He had become increasingly vocal about wanting independence, demanding fairer royalties, and challenging contracts that many believed locked black artists into control they could never quite escape. He wanted ownership. He wanted leverage. He wanted to shield younger musicians from the traps he had seen up close. In that era, for a black artist with his reach, that was not just bold, it was dangerous. By 1967, Aretha had collected enough scattered fragments to feel a very real fear. Rumors circulated in the soul community in studio corners late at night, in brief whispers backstage at festivals, in the shared glances that shut conversations down the moment certain names were spoken. Some people said Sam had angered the wrong executives. Others claimed he was preparing to expose a financial scheme buried in his contracts. A few insisted he had tried to warn other artists about a powerful figure who was tracking his movements too closely. The details were fuzzy, but the tone was always the same. Someone did not want Sam Cooke walking away from the system that had been profiting from him. Aretha couldn't verify which whispers were accurate, but she knew the look she had seen on Sam's face in those final months, a man who had realized too late how tangled the web around him had become. In the early 1970s, spending more time in Los Angeles, Aretha stumbled onto even more unsettling pieces of the puzzle. According to a former SAR Records employee, Sam had been actively negotiating to buy back all of his masters. If true, it would have been an extraordinary move for a black artist in that era. It wasn't just about pride. It was about changing the rules of an entire industry built on stripping ownership away from black talent. And, as the story went, the person who stood to lose the most from Sam's independence was the same man Sam had once told her he did not trust. By 1972, Aretha could no longer pretend the pattern was coincidence. She saw that every major conflict in Sam's last year, the contract disputes, the veiled threats, the sudden obstacles thrown into his path, seemed to lead back to one figure in his professional orbit, a man who had inserted himself quietly, consistently, relentlessly into Sam's business affairs. A man with enough influence to appear everywhere Sam turned, and yet enough power to disappear from public records when it mattered. Aretha did not name him, not then. Sometimes she didn't even say his name in private, but in her mind, the center of the story had shifted. The motel was no longer the starting point. It was the end point of something much bigger. The more she examined the timeline, the clearer it became. In 1975, while performing in Atlanta, she met a former motel employee who quietly claimed that a man had been seen near the office on the night Sam died. A man who left moments before the chaos began. A man no one seemed to question afterward. The employee described his clothing, his build, the restless way he paced outside the office door. Aretha felt the room around her grow colder as she listened. The description matched everything Sam had once told her about a particular figure during the tense conversations they had in the summer of 1964. By the late 1972, Aretha's private conclusion was unavoidable. In her view, Sam's death was not just a single tragic event. It was the final step in a trajectory, a push, a setup, a trap. Each fragment of information fit into the next one, like the edges of a map that had been hidden in plain sight. Sam had been trying to free himself from a system that kept black artists contained, and someone, she believed, had made sure he never fully escaped. The final confirmation, at least in her mind, arrived in the early 1980s. A producer who had been close to Sam during his last year admitted in a private conversation that Sam had become too bold and had been told to slow down. Aretha knew exactly what those words meant. She had heard the same tone of warning aimed at other artists over the years, threats dressed up as advice, concern used as a mask for control. When she stepped back and looked at the full picture she had assembled, the impact was devastating. In her eyes, Sam Cooke hadn't simply stumbled into danger. He had been guided toward it, call by call, meeting by meeting, step by step, until he reached a night he couldn't navigate his way out of. She carried that understanding inside her for decades, letting it harden into something heavy and unmovable. Because for Aretha, this was never just about a dangerous system. She believed there was a person behind it. Someone who pushed Sam toward that final night. Someone the public never truly saw. Someone law enforcement never seriously questioned. Someone Sam Cooke himself had feared. Someone whose name she would not dare to whisper until she believed her own life was almost over. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. By the time the 1,980 seconds rolled in, Aretha Franklin had been living with the weight of Sam Cooke's death for nearly 2 decades. But something in her relationship to that memory shifted during this period. At first, it was subtle. Then it became impossible to ignore. It wasn't that she suddenly uncovered a secret file or discovered some dramatic new witness. It was that the whispers she had gathered over the years finally began to line up so precisely that the absence of one particular name felt louder than any official explanation. This was when Aretha came to believe she was finally seeing the real shape of what happened. In her mind, the man who influenced the final hours of Sam Cooke's life was not the person in the motel office, not the person in the room, not the person in the newspaper headlines. He was someone who had been moving around Sam long before that night. Someone who, in her view, nudged him down a path with only one possible ending. It resurfaced clearly for her after an encounter in 1981, backstage at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. The event was a tribute show, a night dedicated to honoring fallen legends of soul. In one quiet corner, away from the cameras and applause, artists shared memories of Sam, his voice, his plans, the way he talked about the future. Then an older arranger, speaking half to himself, muttered a phrase that froze Aretha in place. He mentioned the problem people Sam could never shake. He didn't clarify, he didn't repeat it. But the words hit Aretha like a file sliding into place in a cabinet that had been waiting for it. As the years moved forward, similar comments kept surfacing. A drummer from one of Sam's early tours said Sam had been circling the wrong company near the end. A former radio promoter remembered that Sam seemed to be controlled by people who clearly did not have his best interests at heart. Then a producer suggested that Sam had been pressured by a behind-the-scenes figure who could open every door for him or slam them shut permanently. None of this was hard evidence. None of it would stand on its own in a courtroom. But from Aretha's perspective, every fragment pointed in the same direction. Slowly, she began to recognize that the same vague silhouette appeared in almost every account, one unnamed figure hovering at the edge of every story about Sam's last year. The more she studied the timeline, the more she felt Sam had been pulled into an orbit he couldn't escape. This sense sharpened in 1984 during a rehearsal at Muscle Shoals. A veteran sound engineer quietly told her that Sam had tried to renegotiate his contracts but found every path blocked, as if the situation had been designed like a maze to keep him trapped in place. As the engineer spoke, Aretha felt that familiar chill crawl up her spine. She remembered Sam pacing backstage years earlier, eyes darting over his shoulder, moving like a man who knew the walls were closing in but couldn't find the door out. By the mid-1,980 seconds, Aretha could no longer ignore the stories she had tried to push aside. She heard from a studio manager in Cleveland who recalled Sam's frustration over a particular executive repeatedly inserting himself into Sam's finances. She heard from a booking agent who remembered shows mysteriously disappearing from Sam's schedule, like someone was quietly stripping opportunities away. And then there was the retired label representative who hinted that Sam had been warned not to pursue ownership of his masters, that it would put him at odds with someone powerful enough to make the consequences feel very real. The pattern, in her eyes, was undeniable. It followed a rhythm. Every time Sam tried to rise above the system, something, or more precisely, someone seemed to push him back down. Those who spoke with Aretha privately said she kept circling one man, one position, one role. A figure with enough status to shape careers, control narratives, manipulate contracts, and erase traces when it suited him. Not someone pulling a trigger in a motel office, but someone setting the trajectory from much further away. As she continued connecting these fragments, the links became so obvious to her that she no longer asked whether there was a hidden hand involved in Sam's downfall. She wondered how anyone could believe there wasn't. In 1987, while recording in New York, she had a long conversation with a former journalist who had spent years researching Sam's life. The journalist described how certain documents related to Sam's final months had gone missing, how files that should have existed were suddenly nowhere to be found. Aretha felt the weight of what was being suggested without either of them having to say it directly. The journalist did not know the name Aretha carried, but the disappearance of those documents seemed to point toward the kind of man who could make awkward details vanish from the record. The final blow, the one that, in her mind, sealed the picture, came in 1991. She met a woman who had once worked as a secretary at a major record company in the 1960 seconds. The woman was elderly and unwell, the kind of person who had little left to lose by telling the truth as she remembered it. She described an atmosphere of tension around Sam's last months, an uneasy buzz in the office hallways, hurried warnings whispered between assistants, and above all, the presence of a high-ranking figure who seemed to monitor Sam more closely than any other artist. She said people in the office quietly referred to him as the Quiet Storm, a man whose power was rarely seen outright, but always felt. That phrase haunted Aretha for years, through the 1990 seconds and into the early 2000s. Traces of what she believed began to slip into her public interviews. She still refused to expose a name, but she left clues the wider audience never caught. She said Sam had the wrong people around him. She said there were doors he walked through that he should have stayed away from. She said his downfall began long before the motel, long before that December night. Each sentence was a breadcrumb. To her, every breadcrumb pointed back to the same shadow. By the time 2010 arrived, Aretha's health began to weaken, and the truth she had carried for half a century grew heavier. Every time she revisited Sam's final year, in her mind the strange business meetings, the unsettling phone calls, the pressure he could never fully name, she saw the same man standing somewhere behind it all. A man whose influence had quietly shaped the careers of countless artists. A man who always seemed to remain untouched while others fell. A man whose closeness to Sam never raised suspicion publicly because it was so constant, so embedded that it looked normal. Then came the winter of 2017, when her body finally began to give way and the line between past and present blurred. In those final months, as she pieced together fragments of the story for her family, she said something they would never forget. She said Sam once confided that he felt trapped by someone, and that if anything ever happened to him, the beginning of the end would come from that person. It was, according to those close to her, the closest she ever came to quoting Sam directly, and the closest she ever came to naming the figure she believed had guided him into danger. Relatives later recalled that whenever Aretha spoke about Sam's death in that last year of her life, she referred to the same presence, the same position, the same structure of power. Even when her voice was barely more than a whisper, she insisted that the motel was the last chapter, not the first. Because in her mind, Sam Cooke did not simply fall into tragedy. He was led there by a man whose name, she believed, still lived in the margins of music history. A man she refused to expose openly because she feared the fallout would land on people who had nothing to do with what happened. As she approached the end of her life, the truth she had carried for 54 years reached the edge of being spoken. She had given everything except the name, and that silence, for those who listened closely, was louder than any direct accusation. It didn't happen in one dramatic speech. It unfolded in fragments slowly, then suddenly. By early 2018, Aretha Franklin's Detroit home had become a place suspended between prayer and preparation. Family moved carefully through the hallways, speaking in hushed tones. Visitors arrived with the kind of quiet that comes when people know time is running out. Underneath the grief, beneath the routine sounds of medical equipment, something else was gathering. Something that had followed Aretha for more than 50 years, waiting for the moment she could finally stop holding it alone. According to relatives, the reveal began on a winter night, when the wind rattled the windows and the house felt unnaturally still. Aretha had barely spoken that day. Her breathing was shallow. Her hands rested motionless under the blankets. A cousin sat nearby, assuming she had drifted into one of her long silences. But as midnight approached, Aretha's fingers moved. Her expression shifted just enough to change the air in the room. The silence no longer felt like the quiet of decline. It felt like the pause before someone finally releases something they have been clutching for too long. Her family leaned closer as she forced herself a little more upright, eyes half open. She wasn't drifting through random memories. She was reaching for a story she had buried so deeply it had almost become a part of her bones. Her lips moved slowly, forming words with effort. Piece by piece, she began to describe what she believed she had understood all along, that Sam Cooke had not simply made a series of bad choices on a chaotic night. In her view, he had been maneuvered, guided, nudged through a series of encounters that left him exposed at exactly the wrong moment. Her voice shook as she revisited the final year of his life, the pressure, the late-night calls, the strange meetings. But this time, she connected them more clearly than she ever had in public. Every point in the story, she said, seemed to lead back to the same shadow. Every whisper she had ever heard, every rumor that reached her backstage or in studio corners, pointed toward the same conclusion. The motel was the final scene, not the beginning. As she spoke, her family saw something flash across her face, not fear of death, but fear of the truth finally being allowed to stand on its own outside of her. She said she had spent decades replaying the signs that most people ignored. The way Sam seemed monitored, the way his push for independence had rattled someone deeply entrenched in the business, the way he had been pressured into meetings he clearly didn't want to attend, the way his circle, in her view, had been infiltrated by a person who operated quietly, strategically, with purpose. Her confession was not the recitation of a full name. It was the outlining of a shape, a position, a presence, a figure whose power had touched too many lives to expose safely, a figure who had been there long before the motel and still held influence long after. Aretha's breathing grew uneven, but she kept going. Decades of silence fractured as she traced the outline of the man she believed had helped lead Sam toward danger. She spoke of the power he held in the 1,960 seconds, the contracts he oversaw, the artists whose destinies he helped decide, the careers he could make or break with a phone call. She said Sam's troubles didn't truly begin with a single argument or robbery. In her eyes, they began with a decision, his choice to fight for ownership, for control, for freedom. By the end, her words were barely more than breath. Her family leaned in so close they could feel it on their skin. With what strength she had left, she described the moment when Sam, according to what he had once shared with her, realized he was being cornered. She described the fear she had seen behind his smile in those final months. She described the man who had woven himself into Sam's life so deeply that it became impossible to tell where professional guidance ended and a carefully laid trap began. And then, with her chest rising in short, jagged breaths, Aretha forced out one last truth as she understood it. Sam Cooke had seen the danger coming, and, in her belief, he had known exactly where it started. Almost immediately after she finished, her body seemed to relax, as if letting the story go had finally loosened something that had been cinched tight inside her for decades. The room went quiet. A nurse adjusted the blankets. A cousin wiped tears from her face. The truth, at least the version Aretha had carried all her life, had finally been spoken, not with a name, not in a way that could be quoted in court, but with enough detail that anyone who understood the history could, in her family's view, follow the trail. Hours later, Aretha closed her eyes for the last time. She died believing she had finally said what she had been too afraid to voice in full while she was still in the public eye. After Aretha's passing, her family tried to make sense of the fragments she left behind. The sentences were incomplete, the details were scattered, but the meaning, to them, was unmistakable. She had not spoken a single name, yet she had drawn an outline so precise that those closest to her felt they knew exactly who she meant. As they compared their memories of private conversations stretching back decades, one realization chilled them. She had always been pointing to the same man. He wasn't some anonymous figure hiding in the shadows of Sam's life. He wasn't an unknown criminal or a stranger stalking from a distance. According to the picture she painted, he was deeply embedded in the center of the music business. A man who shaped deals, controlled contracts, influenced the careers of dozens of black artists in the 1,960 seconds. He didn't have to be at the motel. In Aretha's mind, he never needed to be. His influence was applied long before that night, quietly, strategically, from higher ground. He was, according to what she shared, the man Sam had wanted to escape, the man he argued with, the man he said he feared, the man Sam believed would be the starting point if anything ever went terribly wrong. Aretha's family eventually understood something else. She hadn't kept his name to herself out of doubt. She had kept it quiet out of protection. In their view, this man still held power, even in old age, even behind closed doors, even as the industry changed. Saying his name out loud, they believed, would not bring Sam back or rewrite history. It would only ignite a fire that might burn people who had never been involved, especially younger artists and relatives trying to survive in the same world. So Aretha left the truth not as a headline, but as a whisper, a shape, a presence, a figure that anyone who truly studied the history of that era could, by her design, identify without ever hearing the name spoken. In the end, according to those closest to her, Aretha Franklin died convinced of one thing: Sam Cooke did not just die. In her eyes, he was steered toward his fate by a powerful man who stood to lose everything if Sam fully claimed his own freedom. And that man, the one she hinted at in her final months, remains a ghost in the margins of music history, a ghost whose name the public may never hear, but a ghost whose shadow Sam, by her account, felt long before his last night. So now, after all the timelines, all the shadows, all the fragments Aretha carried to her final breath, the central question is no longer simply how Sam Cooke died. The real question is who began the chain that led to that final night long before he ever stepped onto the motel's concrete walkway. Because if Aretha's belief was even partially right, then the truth did not die with her. It is still out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for someone brave enough to follow the trail all the way to the end. So what do you think? Was Sam Cooke led into danger, or was he hunted? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories the industry allegedly tried to bury, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay close. The next hidden truth might be even darker. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well.